What's on your radar, Briahna?
Well, Robbie, the FBI raid of Mar-a-Lago has put new scrutiny on the FBI and whether it's an institution that deserves the public trust. To some, the question of whether the FBI is untrustworthy and should be abolished is a secondary question to whether they should defend the institution as it carries out what many believe is a warranted investigation into classified documents which Trump took upon leaving the White House, and which the National Archives and Records Administration has been trying to secure since it realized documents were missing in May of 2021. To this camp, the facts are clear. Important correspondence, including correspondence with North Korea's Kim Jong-un, went missing. Trump's team dragged its feet returning the requested documents. There was some threat that confidential documents could be destroyed after reporting that Trump had torn up some documents in violation of the law and that members of his team had mishandled and deleted electronic files. Moreover, they're concerned that Mar-a-Lago, a public resort, was not a secure location for these sensitive documents. Thus, despite Trump lawyers cooperating with requests to search the room containing the files in question back in June and complying with a request to further secure the room holding said documents, as well as a request for some surveillance footage, the August 8th search warranted was, in that camp's eyes, justified. But to others, the FBI raid of Mar-a-Lago is seen as a witch hunt. Trump was substantially cooperating with the investigation, they argue, and the unprecedented nature of the intrusion into a former president's home is not consistent with what he is accused of having taken. They point to Hillary Clinton's mishandling of classified information and the fact that FBI Director Jim Comey at the time identified 7 email chains classified at the top secret/special access program level. And although liberals are quick to point out how hypocritical many Republicans are in defending Trump when they urge the DOJ to lock Hillary up, conservatives point out that Hillary was not, in fact, locked up or prosecuted at all.
Former Secretary of State, one of the president's most important advisors on foreign policy and national security, had a server in her basement that had information that was collected from our most sensitive assets, and it was not protected by anyone. And that's not a crime? That's outrageous.
So remember that. Welcome to Cross Country, everybody. It is that sentiment that has many Americans asking tonight whether we have a two-tiered justice system in this country. Hillary Clinton was never held accountable for her private email server, but now we see an unprecedented raid at former President Donald Trump's private residence. What is your view on the FBI and why they decided to raid the former president's property?
I think they're just a mafia, being ordered by Ray.
And after this man, our ex-president, for so long, they're trying to find any kind of dirt they can pull up on him.
This is insane. I never see this happen in the United States. Biden has to go to jail. Hunter is the one FBI has to go and get it.
Everybody hates him on the left. I mean, he's the only person here that can really, put these guys in jail and really drain the swamp. And that's basically, this has been going on now for over 6 years. Ever since he came down the escalator, they've been after him. Yesterday was the ultimate. We've never seen anything like that in my life.
I believe that they're trying to make it so he cannot run.
The FBI is facing a credibility crisis. The unprecedented nature of the raid, which no one, right or left, contests as anything other than highly unusual, has caused a number of conservatives to even call for the FBI to be abolished. Candace Owens and Marjorie Taylor Greene were 2 high-profile conservatives making this claim last week. And last week on Rising, I argued that the left abolitionist movement should exploit this moment in which conservatives express skepticism of the police to own this issue and push forward legislation that would advance long-term abolitionist goals. After all, as I explained, the FBI has overwhelmingly targeted marginalized groups, civil rights protesters, communists, and labor activists, and not necessarily right-wing groups like the KKK. 85% have been targeted to the left, and only 15% of resources typically go to more right-wing extremist groups. I received a great deal of pushback from liberals, many of whom insisted that I was too naive or too stupid to understand that Marjorie Taylor Greene was acting in bad faith, even though I, of course, said as much repeatedly in the very radar they critiqued. The important thing they insisted was that Trump be prosecuted, prevented from running again due to a legal technicality. That argument, of course, validates what many Trump supporters, like the ones we just heard, believe, that the investigation itself is a bad faith attempt to thwart Trump legally, where he can't be thwarted politically. Now, I'm sympathetic to concerns about the consequences of a second Trump term. Although Trump promised to lower the deficit, drain the swamp, and bring jobs back from overseas, all laudable goals, the national debt rose nearly $7.8 trillion during his time in the White House. He neglected his promise to curb the offshoring of jobs, and the COVID relief package he signed was stuffed with pork for the businesses owned by Trump's biggest donors. Moreover, he offered no solutions to the healthcare crisis, the mass incarceration crisis, or our bloated defense budget. It goes without saying that my political goals do not align with Trump's. But my political goals also do not align with the empowerment of the federal police arm, which has, in fact, regardless of whether you think Trump has broken the law, been an organization that historically overreaches and has been used as a political tool. If Trump has, in fact, violated the law, the Department of Justice is capable of investigating Trump without the FBI. There are numerous other agencies under its purview. So, given that Trump's accountability is not contingent on the existence of the FBI, at least in its current form, and given the historical trend of the FBI doing very little in the way of elite accountability, while it does a great deal to derail grassroots movements, why is so much of the left so stuck on defending these cops? Or at best, why are movements like the Defund the Police movement so disinterested in taking the opportunity to make inroads on their core goal? I, for one, am concerned that the left is cheering the fact that Trump is being investigated for possible violations of the Espionage Act in particular. It's the same law used to intimidate media as well as sources who have provided important information to the public, according to reporting by The Intercept. Trump's DOJ convicted Reality Winner to 5 years under the Espionage Act for leaking a classified document to The Intercept. In 2018, a CIA software developer named Joshua Schulte, who worked on WikiLeaks hacking tools, was charged under the Espionage Act. He faces 80 years in prison. Whistleblower and former drone pilot Daniel Hale was raided by the FBI in 2014 after he leaked classified documents making public America's unaccountable drone program, targeting and killing people around the world, including U.S. citizens. The Trump administration prosecuted him under the Espionage Act, and he was sentenced to 3 years. Of course, unlike these figures, Trump has not acted altruistically here. No one is arguing that Trump has taken these confidential documents in order to expose overreaches by our military. But given the broader context of how these laws are typically deployed to attack altruistic parties, it strikes me as extremely short-sighted not to take advantage of the opening created by disgruntled Trump supporters and principled conservatives alike who have long been concerned about deep state overreach. Here's Professor Alex Vitale, author of End of Policing, making the left case on Democracy Now!
So what are you calling for?
Well, I think we need to, use this rhetorical opening to raise up some existing efforts to try to actually rein in the power of the FBI. You've got groups like Defending Rights and Dissent that's trying to rework the FBI First Amendment Protection Act that John Conyers introduced in the 1980s to restrict the FBI's political policing powers. I think we need to look at the Breathe Act introduced by Ayanna Pressley and others that would reduce funding for federal law enforcement and shift those resources into positive on-the-ground public safety programs. We need to look at efforts to end the war on drugs by groups like the Drug Policy Alliance. We need to get the FBI and federal law enforcement out of using RICO statutes to go after young people in urban areas. The Decriminalizing Neighborhood Network is developing campaigns to rethink the use of the RICO Act. So there really are efforts underway across the country to reduce the power and scope of the FBI in ways that limit their ability to demonize and criminalize those on the left and those who've been left out of the neoliberal consensus.
Clearly, there is a left response to calls to abolish or reform the FBI that cannot be described as a capitulation to Marjorie Taylor Greene. Although I was accused of moving right to work with her on this issue, if the left leads on legislation to address this issue, it has the opportunity to call Marjorie to the mat, to either prove her to be a bad faith operator or, in the alternative, to secure a useful vote from her in passing something meaningful. And here's why this is important. As founder and executive director of the Civil Rights Corps, Alec Karakastanis argued recently, the vast supermajority of search warrant raiders are brutal, unnecessary invasions of the homes of poor families, usually for drugs. It's what killed Briahna Taylor. Much of the rampant abuse of home raiders by armed cops is geared towards stealing the property of mostly poor people. If you don't know about civil forfeiture, it will blow your mind. He went on to tell the story of how, while working at a public defender's office, his very poor clients kept telling him the same story. Quote, they would be walking down the street and DC police would stop them, search them at gunpoint, tell them to open their wallets and take all the cash they had. The wildest part? The DC police would then send them a letter saying that if they wanted to challenge the police, they would need to either pay $250 or 10% of the amount taken, whichever was more. So if the police took $10 or $20 from someone, the person would need to pay $250 to even have the right to challenge the cops in court. If you couldn't pay, the cops kept your money. Now, to understand the scope of this problem, you should know that cops take more money from people in civil asset forfeiture than in all burglaries combined in the United States. Think about that. And think about this other anecdote from Alec about a case he litigated and won here in DC. His client was an 11-year-old girl who was taking a shower before bed when the DC police burst into her bathroom, pulled back the curtain, and pointed guns at her naked body. Cops said they found a little marijuana on her dad 2 weeks before. But her dad did not live in the apartment with her. Most of now the blatantly illegal raids where zero evidence tied the family's home to the crime were black families. At least 99.2% were the homes of black families. And there is next to no accountability for this kind of behavior. Now, we don't know much yet about the extent of Trump's wrongdoing, but we know more than enough about the abuses of law enforcement, particularly abuses by the FBI. And in my opinion, it's deeply negligent to miss an opportunity to respond to a call to protect the substantive rights of the people because but Trump. He's caused enough harm already, I say. Don't let Trump derangement system derail an opportunity to deal a real blow to an institution that has caused much more harm than one very bad president, especially when accountability for Trump is not contingent on protecting harmful institutions. So, Robbie, I just wanted to revisit this again because I feel like we've had more development in terms of potential options for the left, how they could respond, and the kinds of legislation that's kind of already out there and could be seized upon in this moment. And I also want to disentangle this idea that holding Trump accountable is contingent on the existence of the FBI in its current form.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with you. I've said this. It's amazing to watch, some leftists or progressive people who are so wrapped up in, it's TDS. Wrapped up in being anti-Trump that they don't want to even agree with Republicans when Republicans are saying things that they profess to believe. Who cares if it's in bad faith to some degree? I mean, sure, I'll call it out for being in bad faith when I think it is. I think Republicans, if they're going to rail against law enforcement and FBI and all those other organizations that I wish had some accountability, then yes, please vote against them the next time it comes up for a vote. They never do it. I wish they do it next time. And then the left can call them out when they fail to vote along the lines of the things they're saying now. But as long as we're all on the same, or we all have the same immediate goal that these organizations don't have enough accountability and have been used in the service of harassing not just the most powerful man in the country, but also working people, minorities, et cetera, everyone, just common citizens. It's always a threat. That you could trip up, you could do something you don't even know is wrong or illegal, or you could be the victim of civil asset forfeiture is a horrifying thing.
Horrible.
Libertarians have been railing against for forever. People I actually wrote something, and I'll probably do this for Radar next week, Briahna, something kind of connected to civil asset forfeiture for reason. But there's so many cases of people, you could be, the police could search your apartment and not charge you with a crime because they're looking for someone else, they have the wrong apartment, or they're looking for a friend of yours or something. Not charge you with a crime, but they'll take any, if you have cash, let's say you work a job that pays cash, they'll take the cash. And then you have to, the burden of evidence sort of falls to you to argue to them that they have to give it back to you,
right,
which is virtually impossible to do. It's such a stunning abuse of people's rights, and there's nothing ideologically at stake for conservatives or liberals or anyone to defend this. It's just theft. It's just theft. So let's let's work together when we can to reform it.
That's absolutely right. And just one last piece of this is that when I have been speaking to people about this over the last week or so, I had an interesting exchange with Cenk Uygur over at the Young Turks, who substantively came around to a lot of my argument about why it isn't kind of going to the right to meet Marjorie Taylor Greene, but having, if you put forward your own legislation, having the right kind of meet you where you are and advancing the solutions that you think are best from a left perspective. There was still this lingering feeling that, well, if it jeopardizes this current investigation of Trump, it's just not worth it. But when I look at that clip of those Trump supporters protesting outside of Mar-a-Lago and how there is such a credibility crisis around the investigation as it is, it strikes me as being true that having some critique of the FBI as an institution and validating some concerns about the FBI's overreaches, which are true, might help to actually bolster public confidence in a pursuit of Trump or whoever else ends up coming down the pike. Because what's happening right now is liberals are all but saying exactly what the conservatives outside of Mar-a-Lago are saying, right? That it doesn't matter if, this is just a technicality. It's important to stop Donald Trump from running. They're very explicit about how their goals are very much what the Republicans fear. Of course, liberals feel like it's justified. Who cares if you have to get Al Capone on tax evasion? At least you got Al Capone. He's a bad guy. The ends justify the means. Whereas Republicans see this as fundamentally evidence that the system is broken. And I would argue that the way to bridge that gap, to get the outcomes that you want, which is to hold Trump accountable if, in fact, he's proven to have done something illegal, is to rehabilitate the institution that's conducting the investigation.
No, I'm glad you said it. I saw the replies you got on Twitter. a lot of love for you from your own side.
I love my reply guys. They're the best. Well, I'm looking forward to your radar next, Robbie.